إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. As you heard, the topic is As-Sunnah versus Al-Bid'ah, which is a topic that has been repeated many times, and it should be repeated at all times, because we need to always go back to the foundations of the religion. And the Prophet ﷺ, he would remind his ummah every Jumu'ah in Khutbat al-Hajah, when he addresses the people in Salatul Jumu'ah, as we hear the Khutbat al-Hajah every week, which is, we just heard part of it that has been just mentioned now. But in it, فإن أصدق الحديث كلام الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. That the Prophet ﷺ praises Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the perfect praise and humble himself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Guidance is in the hands of Allah. Whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides, no one can lead astray. And whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala misguides, no one can guide. Some people, they have an issue with this. They say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would misguide someone. Guidance is in the hands of Allah, and it's all by the wisdom of Allah and the power of Allah. And He's the most just subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the human beings, when they lead themselves astray, when they open the gates of deviation to their own selves, then they basically take in the means for their hearts to be misguided and to be deviated. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَلَمَّا زَاغُوا أَزَاغَ اللَّهُ قُلُوبَهُم. When they deviated, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deviated their hearts. So therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it easy for those who are sincere. Just come forward and be sincere and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ, and do whatever in your capacity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide, and He guides whoever He wills. But this is something that needs to be well established in one's belief, so that the person humble himself to Allah. You don't own even your own guidance. And that's why there's the guidance of al-bayan, something to be made clear, which is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the path of guidance. These are the endless paths of deviation and misguidance. And inna hadaynahu sabila imma shakiran wa kafura. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us and guided us to the ways to be able to choose. And then the hidayah of the tawfiq, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make tawfiq, to guide the hearts of the people, whoever He wills subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's fair enough to say like this, ala al-itlaq, like this: whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, He guides. We're not talking about a human being that has deficiency and deficiencies. We're talking about the Creator of the heavens and the earth, the most just, the most merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala. He would never treat His creation with anything with injustice whatsoever. And He's the most merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nothing is the like of Allah. And it's always these misconceptions or وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ سُوءِ الظَّنِّ بِاللَّهِ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى, or thinking bad about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because people do not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, or they think of what they think about the human beings. So to humble ourselves, that guidance is in the hands of Allah. So within this khutbat al-hajah, the Prophet ﷺ would repeat, and he would mention in it that the most truthful in speech is the book of Allah, and the best guidance is the guidance of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Very clear. And this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved for us. And then after saying this, he warned against the opposite of it, what negates it, which is, and the Prophet ﷺ would say, فَإِنَّ كُلَّ مُحْدَثَةٍ بِدْعَةٍ وَكُلَّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ وَكُلَّ ضَلَالَةٍ فِي النَّارِ. Warning against the newly introduced matters. And he said, فَإِنَّ كُلَّ مُحْدَثَةٍ, something that get introduced to the people is bid'ah, is innovation in the religion. Not innovation of having a microphone or this or that. Innovation, and that's the definition of the bid'ah, in matters of deen. Matters to be known by the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And every bid'ah, there's no exception. There's no good bid'ah and bad bid'ah. وَكُلُّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ. Every bid'ah is dalala, is astray. And every astray is in the hellfire. Because again, this goes back And the subject of al-bid'ah and the sunnah is the entire deen of al-Islam. So we have only 20 or 25 minutes, inshallah ta'ala, to take some of the principles, some of the foundations for us to relate everything, to protect ourselves in the time of fitan that we face. And we know that for a fact now everybody is having easy access to everything. The worst kufr, the worst words of disbelief, people got exposed to it. The Iblis, shaitan, when he would deceive people, it's up front like this. Everything, every dalala is mentioned, and also matters of goodness are mentioned. So how can a person differentiate and be able to separate from what's good and from what's bad? This is a mandatory knowledge that is upon each and every one of us. So as mentioned before, and that's how the ilm is to be constantly repeated. Our goal is to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be saved from the hellfire. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, guidance to mankind. This is the way for us to be successful in this life and in the hereafter. Our concern is the hereafter. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the owner of this life and in the hereafter. And we're talking about wahy. And we're talking about the first pillar of Islam, the most important thing in our life. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. And if you remember, very easy for us to memorize it even, young and old. When you say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah, 4 major things that you need to be aware of. Whether you have the knowledge of it, and part of it, it's a mandatory knowledge upon everyone. And some of the details you might sufficient for you to ask a person of knowledge if you do not know. But they are the foundations of the deen. 4 things. When it comes to la ilaha illallah, we mentioned it before. What does la ilaha illallah means? What is referring to? The tawheed of Allah, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship. What breaks that? What negates that, as the Quran clearly states and warning against what negates la ilaha illallah? Ash-shirk, associating partners with Allah, kufr, and so on. So a person has to be aware of what is shirk, what is kufr, so that the person protects la ilaha illallah in his life. It is not sufficient to just know it, but we have to know the evil to avoid it. So la ilaha illallah, that comprises 2 things that we need to learn what the tawheed is, and this is the matters of belief. We have to learn it because it's wahy, it's matters of unseen, versus what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam made it very clear that it's shirk with all its categories. Muhammadur Rasulullah, the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam, is the one to be followed. And as we heard in Khutbat al-Hajah, to follow the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, you have to make sure that you're upon these 2 things. And that is to follow his way alayhi salatu wasalam, which is the sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And that's not sufficient till you stay away from everything that is being introduced, that it's not part of the sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So as a shirk negates the tawheed, the bid'ah negates the sunnah. And the bid'ah is not a newly word that is invented by people that came later. That's something the Prophet ﷺ warned his ummah from, clearly. And he would repeat it. It's not just one hadith that you would find it in the books. He would repeat it to the people every Jumu'ah. So it shows the seriousness of it. And that's why to understand these 2 things, and with the details of that, it requires many matters of knowledge, and to explain it with examples and so on. So the sunnah, and subhanAllah, today after Salatul Jumu'ah, someone was asking about the word As-Sunnah when it comes to the Salah. What is the difference between the Nafl and Sunnah and things like this? The word Sunnah, actually when you look at it linguistically, it shares some of the meanings with the bid'ah. How is that? As-Sunnah is the way, linguistically the way. And it's of course referring to the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And al-bid'ah is something that is invented, which is the ways of other than the Prophet ﷺ. So a person has to take a way. He has to take a path. Whether it's the way of the Prophet ﷺ, or he's not in some neutral zone. No, he has to be taking something else if he doesn't take the way of the Prophet ﷺ. This is how things are. And that's why if a person is not upon the tawheed, he's not going to be in some, again, neutral zone between the tawheed and the shirk. He will fall into shirk. So that's why we have to learn the tawheed to be upon it. We have to warn ourselves from the shirk. And that's why a very important concept here also is that the things that we are commanded to stay away from, you are actually doing an action. People think of when you stay away from something, you're not doing anything. No, you're doing something. You're doing something that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. and that is for you to stay away from something. So staying away from shirk, staying away from bid'ah, knowing it and to be warned against it, this is an act of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when it comes to the word As-Sunnah, and you probably also, many of you heard it many times before, it's okay to use one word in many different contexts of things. So when we talk about the Sunnah in the general sense, this is what we need to follow. We follow the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the way of the Prophet ﷺ, the foundation of this deen. And both are wahy from Allah. These are matters of belief, by the way. Matters of aqidah, that there is two wahy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and we talked about that many times. Also, sometimes it depends on the context. The word Sunnah can refer to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, Kutub al-Sunnah, the books of Sunnah, to differentiate that from the Quran. And that would include everything that is from the Prophet ﷺ, and it can be in all subjects of the deen. Matters of aqidah, matters of fiqh, matters of akhlaq, purification of one's soul, everything. Which is the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, his actions, what he even approved of ﷺ. Things happens at his time ﷺ, and he approves it. Without saying anything, that means it's part of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is in the also general sense of what the sunnah when it comes to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. When you read it in the books of fiqh, when we're taking the durus of al-fiqh, when the fuqaha, when the people of fiqh, the actions of tahara, purification, salah, siyam, things of that nature, when they use the word sunnah, they refer to a very specific meaning of the sunnah, which is the recommended acts. And this is when you pray the sunnah prayer. Right? Sunnah prayer to differentiate it from the fard prayer. So in the context of the salah, in context of the fiqh, matters of fiqh, this is the recommended acts. If you leave it, you're not sinful. And if you do it, you get rewards. And when it says the sunnah, that means you should do it. You should treat it as if it's fard, if you have the ability to do it, not to neglect it, not to belittle it. But it's to be able to know, is there a kafara, an expiation? Do I need to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if I don't do it? Things like this. And that's why we should follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ also in the recommended acts. And in many cases also when the ulama, they mention the sunnah versus the bid'ah. The sunnah versus the bid'ah. They say it in a context, and the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that in the hadith that we also heard it many times before, and we should memorize this hadith. And it's famous by the Sahabi that reported the hadith. The hadith is called Hadith Al-Irbad ibn Sari. Hadith of who? Al-Irbad ibn Sari. Remember the name. The name is not usually mentioned many times from the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, but it's a foundation of this deen. Hadith Al-Irbad ibn Sari. When the Prophet ﷺ, he gave a maw'idha, admonition, and I won't quote the entire hadith because of the time. Prophet ﷺ gave them maw'idha, baligha. Imagine you're listening to an admonition, a reminder from the Prophet ﷺ that was given jawami' al-kalim, the best ways of speech and the most comprehensiveness in speech. And even with the eloquency of the Prophet ﷺ, it's not even close to the ways of the Quran. Quran, miraculous, it's the words of Allah. So he gave them maw'idha, baligha, reminded them of the hereafter. And that's what the maw'idha always take you to the end of things. If there is maw'idha does not take us to the end of things, it's lacking, it's deficient. The maw'idha is to take us to the end of things, the Jannah and the Hawfaya, the Day of Judgment, and the effect of our actions in the hereafter, because this is how the wahy is. So after the Prophet ﷺ reminded them of this, and they said to the Prophet ﷺ, and even though they were shedding tears, وَجِلَتْ مِنَ الْقُلُوبِ وَذَرَفَتْ مِنْهَا الْعُيُونِ, he was explaining what happened to the Sahaba when the Prophet ﷺ made this maw'idha, this admonition, this reminder, that their hearts become full of al-wajal, is the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and their eyes were shedding tears. So they said to the Prophet ﷺ, كَأَنَّهَا مَوْعِظَةُ مُوَدِّعٍ. This is as if it looks like the farewell speech for someone. That means he gave them what is, when someone is about to leave and never come back, he would give the most important thing for people that they need to know. So they asked the Prophet ﷺ to give them wasiyah, to give them advice, that they would hold fast to it and they would never forget. And that's why we should treat it that way. The Prophet ﷺ within this wasiyah, within this commands that the Prophet ﷺ commanded them to be upon, to listen and to obey and so on. And then he said, فَإِنَّهُ مَن يَعِشْ مِنكُمْ فَسَيَرَى اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. He's addressing the Sahaba. Whoever lives among you, he would see اختلافًا. اختلاف means differences. كثيرًا, not just small differences, but major differences and lots of differences. فإنه ما يعش منكم فسيرى اختلافا كثيرا. Then he guided them عليه الصلاة والسلام and guided the ummah of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام by saying فعليكم بسنتي. So he called it sunnati, sunnah. Be upon my sunnah, my way. That does not mean the optional acts of salah. It means the entire deen of Islam. The way of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, and wait till the end. فعليكم بسنتي, be upon my sunnah. وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين المهديين من بعدي. And the sunnah of the khulafa al-Rashidin, the ones that were guided, or Mahdiin is guided. Al-Rashidin, those who are upon what is upright and what is correct. And who are the Khulafa al-Rashidin? Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali. Be upon their way. And the Prophet ﷺ called them Al-Khulafa al-Rashidin al-Mahdiyin. They were guided. They're from the people of Jannah. Who else? What more blessings that this ummah has that no nations before had the like of this. That it's not just the time of the Prophet ﷺ, also after the Prophet ﷺ, those who led the ummah, Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, then Ali radiallahu anh, they are from the people of Jannah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them, and they are pleased with him. And the Prophet ﷺ said that in his lifetime, which is a miraculous thing by itself, that they would live after him and they would be upon matters of guidance. And how they applied the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes an obligation upon us, because by the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, not because of some historical reasons we follow. No, we follow the wahy. The wahy says, فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِسُنَّتِي وَسُنَّةِ, and he called it sunnat. وَسُنَّةِ الْخُلَفَاء الرَّاشِدِينَ الْمَهْدِيِّينَ مِنْ بَعْدِ. And he said, عَضُّوا عَلَيْهَا بِالنَّوَاجِذِ, bite on it with your molar teeth. فَعَضُّوا عَلَيْهَا بِالنَّوَاجِذِ. Then he warned against what negates the first 2-3 statements. So the first 2-3 statements, we heard them before many times, right? So فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِسُنَّتِي, be upon my sunnah, and the sunnah of the Khulafa al-Rashidin al-Mahdiyin al-Ba'di. And he added to this, عَضُّوا عَلَيْهَا بِالنَّوَاجِذِ, because they keep on taking it away from you. You will be tested with this. فَعَضُّوا عَلَيْهَا بِالنَّوَاجِذِ. Then he said, وَإِيَّاكُمْ وَمُحْدَثَاتِ الْأُمُورِ, and be warned against the newly introduced matters. فَإِنَّ كُلَّ مُحْدَثَةٍ بِدْعَةٍ وَكُلَّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ وَكُلَّ ضَلَالَةٍ فِي النَّارِ. Because every newly introduced matter, in the context meaning introduced matter to what? To the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, to the sunnah of Al-Khulafa al-Rashidin. Every newly invented matter is bid'ah, innovation, and every innovation is deviation, every deviation in hellfire. The question is there any more clarity than this that the ummah is in need of? This is so clear. This is from the usul. This is from the foundations of the deen. This is wasiyat muwadda'. This is farewell wasiyah. And it's very clear, muhkama, very straightforward. No one should ever contradict it by one's actions or one's belief and so on. So here the Prophet ﷺ, he put it together, the sunnah versus the bid'ah. In khutbat al-haja, and in this hadith, farewell wasiyah from the Prophet ﷺ, and this is in Sunan Abi Dawud and others. So the Prophet ﷺ himself, he mentioned the sunnah versus the bid'ah. So for you to say the sunnah, it is not complete unless you warn against the bid'ah. The same thing when you say the tawheed is not complete till you warn against the shirk. And this is, by the way, one of the ways to be able to know what is right and what is wrong. When people just try to say things to make people happy and that's it, this is not the goal of this deen. The goal of this deen is to convey the truth. So the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ versus the bid'ah in matters of belief, in matters of ibadah, in every matter, by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to how it's used, and one of which is this. The ayat and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that talks about this are so many, and the statements of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And when you look at on the things that get introduced, and is that preserved? Yes. The sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is preserved? Yes. The Sunnah of the Khulafa al-Rashidin is preserved, yes. Their understanding of the Deen of Islam, yes. And what happened to the things that came after that? Turn away from it. One of which, and this is just examples. It's not. Otherwise, if you talk about the bid'ah, you need an encyclopedia. But when you talk about the Sunnah, it's there. But when something is, if someone invented for people to seek blessings from a mosquito, for example, where are you going to record this? There's endless things as far as the details of it. But for example, something that get introduced in matters of aqeedah, matters of belief, like ilm al-kalam, philosophy. And they teach it. And they keep on teaching it to the people, philosophy and establishing the evidences of matters of aqeedah with philosophy and the laws of Aristotle and Aflatun and all of these types of people. This is not the ways of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ or the Sunnah of the Khulafa al-Rashidin. And they would call it aqeedah. It's unfair to call it aqeedah. The aqeedah is the aqeedah of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the way it was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, the Tabi'een. That's why if you want to learn your aqeedah, learn it from the early generations of Islam. We have, even when things get introduced, the major bid'ah that happened to the ummah, whether it's like the sects of al-Murji'ah or the Qadariyah or the Khawarij or the Mu'tazilis and the like of this, and the ways of these groups or these sects is still happening in this ummah with different, even the names might be different, but the same concepts are there. But then when you see how the ulama of this ummah, they preserve the matters of aqeedah when people start deviation from it and bringing back the people to the usul and to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and you would see that their books of aqaid is always musnada with narrations. So ayat of the Quran, hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, statements of the Sahaba, statements of the Tabi'een, the Imma of this deen, their aqeedah were upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said and what the Prophet ﷺ taught this ummah. And in matters of ibadah also, and so matters of aqeedah, so that's why the bid'ah versus the sunnah. The sunnah is, what is the sunnah in matters of belief? So the sunnah is basically also related to matters of belief. We need to learn our aqeedah. As mentioned before, the aqeedah that makes a person a Muslim versus a disbeliever is definitely the pillars of al-Iman. But then a person, when he becomes a Muslim, he needs to make sure that he perfects his aqeedah to save himself from the deviation. Some of these deviations can take the person outside the fold of al-Islam, and some of these deviations might not take him outside the fold of al-Islam, but it's still deviations in aqeedah. So you have to perfect your aqeedah with the usul, with the principles that the people of Ahl Sunnah were upon, according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ and the way of the Khulafa al-Rashidin. And the same thing with matters of ibadat, the salawat, fasting, the adhkar. Isn't it, again, the very simple question, isn't it sufficient for the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, for each and every one of us, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way the Prophet ﷺ worshipped Allah? Even when people, they say things, well, there's nothing wrong with doing this, there's nothing wrong with doing that, even though that is wrong and it negates one of the principles of the deen, because you can't do anything in the deen unless you know for sure that this is the way of the Prophet ﷺ. Knowledge comes first. But for the sake of argument, and this is also one of the ways of the Quran, if you go to what they're saying, isn't it safe enough and spacious enough and good enough that even if you say it's okay, but why don't you just stick to the things that the Prophet ﷺ was upon? Why is it not spacious enough? Why is it tight for you that you have to invent a tariqah for someone? And you would give bay'ah and pledge for people to say this dhikr, or to do this way, or to wear this thing, or to act like this. Where is the Prophet ﷺ doing this? Silence. It's okay. And then they start to make it as if it's a madhab from the madhab. You have your madhab, I have your madhab. No, it's not about madhabs. The madhabs that is valid, the four madhab of the imma, which is agreed upon from the people of Ahl-Sunnah, that this is the madhab of the people of Ahl-Sunnah, Imam Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad. But these bid'ah, never, the four ai were upon innovations in the deen. They had differences of opinions based on the wahy from Allah, from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And there are reasons for these slight differences of opinions in the furu', in the branches of the deen. Even if the hadith is weak, for example, it does not make the ruling that comes from a weak hadith makes it bid'ah. No, it doesn't make it a bid'ah. makes it a weak opinion according to those who know. But according to the masses, if they follow their ulama, they're fine as long as they ask the people of knowledge. But this is not in the category of bid'ah. The bid'ah is something else. But since we mentioned the weak hadith, just something on the side like this, one of the things that protects the person from the bid'ah, if the hadith is not just weak, because there's gradings of the hadith, if it's fabricated, yes, acting upon it becomes bid'ah. So there's no excuse in following a fabricated hadith. And as mentioned before, it's by the mercy of Allah that He perfected this deen, that the ulama of this ummah, they compiled and preserved everything. The authentic, the weak, the fabricated, the lies. Anyone that lied about the Prophet ﷺ, sure we record them. And they record it, and they have volumes and volumes of fabricated hadith and things that people said. Isn't that a miraculous thing? No nation ever done this. So that if someone now invented something, they will say, well, we have it already. There's no more inventions. All of the lies and everything, we have it there. So it's all preserved. And that's why we should appreciate the work of the ulama of the hadith and how they preserved for this ummah the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's part of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised, that He would preserve the deen. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ حَافِظُونَ. This is not the work of the human beings. This is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it never happened on the face of earth, this work that is done to preserve the deen of Allah. The Quran is very obvious from the beginning to the end. The sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted goodness for this ummah to elevate their levels and ranks of rewards, they would exert themselves and doing more efforts. That's why they would travel for months to get a hadith here and there, and compiled the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, again everything, fabricated, weak and authentic and everything like this. So this is how the way of the Prophet ﷺ, someone that is fabricated something, that yes, following that is a matter of or innovation in the deen. So the ayat and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ are so many like this. The ai the four ai how they called the people to follow the sunnah and to be warned against matters of bid'ah. And since I said there are so many different things when it comes to this, and warnings and glad tidings and things of that nature, we have to, it's upon each and every one of us, since we are in times of bid'ah, times of fitan, times of fitan, right? If we are at times when the deen is so apparent, clear, the time of Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman and Ali, right? At these times, the matter is easy, right? When it comes to knowing what is right and what is wrong. But when you live in a time when everything is being presented, then you have to put more effort. And that's what the times of fitan, it's why it's times of fitan. It's very dangerous, and it also can be times that elevate the person to the best levels. As we know the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, أنه سيأتي على أمتي زمان القابض فيه على دينك القابض على جمر من نار. That a time would come that the one that holds fast to his religion is like holding fast to a hot coal. أجر الواحد منهم, the reward of one of them is like 50 of you, 50 of the Sahaba. So the reward can be such a great reward, but it's very difficult, as if he's holding to a hot coal. Versus, that means what? That means many people would be slipping away, because it's so many tribulations and trials and evil and things of that nature if a person does not protect himself. So what does that mean? That means the effort has to be more. So what used to be spacious for you and easy for you as a Muslim at certain times, where as long as you go pray in the masjid and the ulama are in abundance, mashallah, if you have any issue, you ask the person of knowledge and he give you the answer, and that's it. No virtual world, and no everybody speaking, you never know this is shaitan or alim or whatever there is. Right? So when now things are the way that we know it, then it becomes extra effort has to be done. So that's why we have to be aware of these things. We have to question the things that we do, the things that we listen to, and we always have to go back to these principles. And if we don't have the knowledge, we should ask the people of knowledge. And that should be sufficient for us. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. But we leave ourselves to whatever we think is good. You know, the Salafus Salih, the early generations of Islam, they used to call the bid'ah something. They used to call it al-ahwa, desires. And they would call the people of al-bid'ah ahlul ahwa, the people of ahwa, desires. Why? Because the bid'ah will fit some desires in one's heart. It feels good, sounds good, tastes good, looks good, all kinds of things like religiously wise. Right? But that's why it's ahwa. You have wahy, you have revelation that has to be protected, and the person to stay away from all of these matters of bid'ah. We'll finish inshallah ta'ala in 4 minutes at 8:10 inshallah. As we mentioned the long hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, then we should always refer back to it, and how when he saw the people with beads making dhikr and he got so angry. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to be extremely upset and angry when they see someone introduce something in the religion that it's not the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Whether it's the way of making dhikr. So there are principles that the ulama they made, and that's why the definition of al-bid'ah is tariqa mukhtara'a fi din. It's something that is invented in the deen. So it has to be with matters of deen. And it's something that is introduced, that means there's no like of it before, or it's a way that it's introduced. So if it's matters of ibadah, like someone introducing a way to make dhikr that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do, as people dancing or jumping or moving right and left or things of that nature. And we have to remember one thing, and I want you to also pay attention with me inshallah ta'ala 2-3 minutes to get to understand these principles. Because sometimes people, they say, not everything the Prophet ﷺ left or didn't do, that means we should stay away from it. The Prophet ﷺ didn't use microphone. He didn't use tablets and all kinds of things. So people, they become confused. Well, it's very easy and simple. If it's matters of the norm of the life of the people, their cultures, the aada, the habits of the people, this is, if the Prophet ﷺ left it, you don't have to leave it. The type of food that the Prophet ﷺ used to like to eat versus the food that he didn't eat. The way that the Prophet ﷺ would wear, for example, the head cover of the Prophet ﷺ. If you're from a certain parts of the world that you cover your head, covering the head is, by the way, is from the Sunnah. Yes, the Prophet ﷺ used to cover his head. But with what? Is there a specific way? If you are from this part of the world or the other part of the world and you cover your head with something, and you cover your head with that, you're following the Sunnah, mashallah. Prophet ﷺ used to cover his head. Things like this, based on the adat. But when it comes to matters of deen, something that people would seek rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by doing it, this is where the bid'ah comes in place. So matters of belief, matters of aqidah is to be known, this is unseen. So how can someone introduce to the people something in aqidah that it's not from the aqidah that the Prophet ﷺ taught his ummah? And that's why even very specific, the names and attributes of Allah. Why would someone deny some of the attributes of Allah and approve some of the attributes of Allah? Based on their aql, based on their reason. And they say this is how the ummah changed. Where is the ummah at the time of the Prophet ﷺ? No change whatsoever. The same thing with matters of ibadah, matters of dhikr, things of that nature. This is ibadah. And always, for example, the subject of al-mawlid comes in place. The mawlid, the people that seek rewards from Allah by establishing the mawlid, is not from the aada or the culture. This is religion to these people, religion. They seek rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if it's religion and they seek rewards from Allah, then seek to be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the matter has been completed, sealed, no room for anyone to introduce anything in matters of the deen. So to remember this fact that if it's something in the adat and the cultures, the matter is easy. Unless there is a nas or a text that even makes the culture in such a way. And also the best culture is the culture of the early generations of Islam, no doubt about this. But this also needs to be well established with ilm, so that we don't open the door for things that is against the deen. But then when it comes to the matters of deen, matters of aqidah, matters of ibadah, matters of fiqh, before we do anything, we have to make sure that this is the way of the Prophet ﷺ, and we don't allow ourselves to introduce something that that is not part of the religion of Islam. Whether it's to divide people based on this or to establish an action. And that's why the subject is a detailed one, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from that. So the goal of this talk, and then inshallah ta'ala later on we can talk in more specifics and more details and more qawa'id and principles, is just to be aware of it. That we need to be warned against something called al-bid'ah, and to be upon the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and to ask the people of knowledge and to warn ourselves from anything that has been introduced that wasn't at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or the early generations of Islam. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم.